So it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dan Cooper. Dan is currently the Associate Vice Chancellor for Clinical and Translational Science at the University of California at Irvine. He recently completed his service as Chair of Pediatrics at UC Irvine, and he is the Principal Investigator of the UC Irvine CTSA program. Dan got his MD from the University of California at San Francisco and then did his pediatrics training at NYU and Bellevue. He did a 3-year fellowship in pediatric pulmonary medicine under the mentorship of Robert Mellons at Columbia. And then he was recruited to Harvard UCLA, where he worked closely in with the pioneering exercise scientists Brian Witt and Carmen Wasserman. So Dan is a pediatric pulmonologist and a critical care physician, ran a very busy pediatric intensive care unit in the course of his career. But I think that Dan's passion for clinical medicine is matched equally by his passion for research. And he has really spent the lion's share of his career focusing on mechanisms that link exercise, growth, and health in babies and children. Some notable accomplishments: Dan founded the Pediatric Exercise and Genomic Research Center, or PERC, at UC Irvine in 2003. And this is dedicated to uncovering biologic mechanisms of exercise that can be used to improve lifelong health in children, both children who are healthy and children who have chronic disease. He's one of the principal investigators of Project Healthy, which was a pioneering national study involving about 3,000 middle school children designed to reduce obesity and type 2 diabetes through school-based nutrition and physical exercise programs. And the results of this project, as many of you know, was published in the New England Journal of Medicine as a seminal study. More recently, Dan's laboratory group has focused on mechanisms that link systemic physiologic exercise responses in healthy children, in children with chronic disease, and children with disability. His laboratory is funded through grants from the NIH, and recently his group was named as the National Pediatric Center for Multi-Site NIH Common Fund Study to uncover molecular mechanisms through exercise influences on health, or MOTORPATH. And Dan's going to talk to us about MOTORPATH. Dan?
Thanks, everybody. I guess you can hear me, and this is a really high-tech thing. It probably won't work. I have some video clips and stuff like that. I may have to do a modern dance interpretation if it doesn't work. It's a pleasure to be here. I was at Children's when I was a fourth-year medical student back in the calendar day, 1974, and the month that I spent, not in this area, it was in a previous place where Children's was just a terrific month for me, and it actually convinced me to go into pediatrics. And so I have very, very fond memories. And I also have had the great distinction of working with Lisa, who is one of the leaders of the CTSAs, the Clinical Translational Science Awards. We've done some terrific things in partnership. We created a program called CHAMP, which stands for Child Health Research Acceleration Through Multi-Site Planning. And it was really designed to fill the gap that we both perceive of support for investigator-initiated child health-focused projects. And this has really blossomed, and it's been such a pleasure to work with Lisa, and you guys are lucky to have her here. So that was for dinner last night, by the way. We're going to, hopefully I will leave a lot of time for questions, because for me, really what's fun is the interaction. I'm going to try to cover a lot of stuff today. I have nothing to disclose, and I'm not particularly proud of it. I mean, in my career, I've tried to get bribes and trips to Hawaii, but we pediatricians, we just don't rank up there, so there's nothing I can disclose right now. So here's what we're going to try to do today. We'll talk about physical activity and child health, just stuff that I think everybody knows, but just a quick review, why it's important. VO2 max and other sorrows. How many of you have heard of VO2 max, right? Everybody's heard of VO2 max. What I have to say is very iconoclastic. I think we need to move away from VO2 max. We'll talk about that. I think it has implications for what we do as pediatricians. A little bit beyond gas exchange, looking at exercise and omics, genomics, and some of the things that we can discover from exercise research. And the brave new world, where we're heading with this really interesting and integrative physiology. So remember, children are not just miniature adults. Everybody knows there. When I made this slide, they made me put this de-identification in. So in case any of you know these people, I didn't want to get in trouble. Don't you love HIPAA? We love HIPAA, don't we? Okay, so here's a pretty simple concept, and that is when you think about the levels of physical activity, and you imagine here they're low, here they're higher, in a healthy child, I think it's pretty apparent that there are certainly insufficient levels of physical activity. I mean, we see obesity, we see cardiovascular disease risk, whether a child is obese or not, if they're very physically inactive. There's probably a very wide range, which we haven't quite defined precisely, where you get the optimal health effects. I don't think it's linear. I think there's kind of a range of activity. And then there is excessive or dangerous exercise, and we need to recognize that as well. In some parts of where I'm from, in Orange County, children are often sort of pushed into athletics at a very young age. Parents have money to support this. I talked about this with some of your wonderful biomedical engineering group. You know, you have kids 11 and 12 years old who are pitching 5,000 pitches a week. And you wonder what that is doing to that very integrated joint, the shoulder joint, and many of them are reporting lifelong problems. So there is excessive exercise as well. What I'd like you to think about is what happens in the child who has a chronic disease. And in a chronic disease, finding the health benefit of exercise, I think, is a great challenge that we have. And it's like the proverbial threading of the needle, because the range of physical activity that a kid with a chronic disease condition or disability can do, or the kinds of activities that they can do, becomes much narrower. And here, you know, you'll often hear when you talk about physical activity or exercise that, you know, we don't need to study this. Kids should just be allowed to go out and play. Everybody here knows that even that is problematic in the kind of society we live in. But when we talk about kids who have had surgery for congenital heart disease, or a child with asthma, or cystic fibrosis, or cerebral palsy, we know that this question of where the health benefits are, and by where I mean how much exercise, how many calories, what kinds of exercise, this is an area that we really don't understand. And certainly even in these kids, there can be a range of excessive exercise. So like any therapeutic intervention that we have, we really as physicians need to consider the insufficient, the beneficial, and the excessive. And then when you think about, we won't have time to go through all of these, but certainly we know that the beneficial effects of exercise really include cardiovascular health, bone mineralization, a lot of interesting work on cognitive function and executive function in exercise. Won't have too much time to talk about that, but it's a really fascinating area. Dangerous exercise, we know there's overuse syndrome, there's injury, there may even be impaired growth. You know, for many years, female gymnasts, before the rest of the world started looking into this, you know, the ideal female gymnast was prepubertal, had strenuous exercise, malnutrition. Many of them were developing pathological fractures, et cetera. So there's that problem. And then with a sedentary lifestyle, there certainly is sarcopenia. There's chronic inflammation and obesity, insulin resistance, and the list goes on and on. So these are real health problems. And I'd like you to also think about this vicious cycle that we're seeing over and over again in children, where the environment, could be obesity, it could be chronic disease, impacts physical, it promotes physical inactivity. Obviously, there's decreased active play, and we're all dealing with the problem of increased screen time. This leads to a very sedentary lifestyle. Then we have this problem that we call relentless deconditioning, and this is a really interesting biological problem. How many of you have ever had a limb in a cast from a fracture? So you know what happened when you took that cast off, right? And I overheard on the elevator on the way up here this conversation, I think was one of your ICU docs saying, yeah, we got to talk about that muscle wasting that takes place in the ICU, right, where you have bed rest plus inflammation. Just immobilization leads to, for reasons biologically that we don't completely understand, but this relentless deconditioning, this loss of muscle mass. So that then happens in these kids. So their ability then, okay, I pushed the back key. Really, there we go. Okay, so their ability to, this reduced continued reduction in physical fitness. And it's really interesting that if you take a group of kids who are physically inactive, and we've done several studies like this, and you control for body weight. We once looked at a group of high school girls who were all normal weight, 50th percentile BMI. Half the kids were involved in physical activity and sports in high school. Half were very sedentary.
I'm sorry.
And now, as I got to the top of that mountain, I realized I was in the wrong place. So we found that if you looked at inflammatory mediators like IL-6, C-reactive protein, just the physical inactivity without the obesity was enough to cause increases in those inflammatory mediators. So there is really this interesting relationship between inflammation, physical activity, and physical fitness. And then these clearly have immediate health effects and health impairment across the lifespan. And I think those of you who, and I know everybody, we are pediatricians, we interact, whether we're subspecialists or not, we're always to some degree general pediatricians, and we talk to general pediatricians. I've heard from so many of the general pediatricians in my community that, 20 or 30 years ago, pediatrics was predominantly an infectious disease discipline, and we were dealing with kids with infectious diseases. And now we deal much more with chronic disease. And in healthy kids, we're really often talking to parents about what is my child doing at age 6, 7, 8, and 9 that will lead to a healthy adulthood. And I think you'll find when you talk to the pediatricians out in the community that this is really becoming a topic that parents are very interested in. And of course, the role of physical activity here, and we'll talk about this in a second, is really quite important. And there is a paucity of interventions that are specifically designed for inactive youth. And so this is this vicious cycle that we see played out in many of our children, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. So what is the data that suggests that we actually can track low levels of physical activity in childhood through adulthood? These are hard studies to do. Both Lisa and I have asked for 20 years of NIH funding. I don't think we ever got it. But you really need long-term studies to do this. But there are a number of them. This is one from the Journal of Obesity. Childhood fitness reduces the long-term cardiometabolic risk associated with childhood obesity. And this was a 20-year follow-up of 1,700, almost 1,800 adults who were studied originally when they were between the ages of 7 and 15. So they were able to study in this cohort a relatively large number of people for a pretty long period of time. And this is what they found. The childhood waist circumference and cardiorespiratory fitness were both strongly associated with cardiometabolic health later in life. It's important for us to know that there is good data that talks about the tracking. It is important what the level of physical activity is in healthy children. The next thing that they found was that higher levels of cardiorespiratory fitness during childhood substantially reduced the risk of adult metabolic syndrome, even among those with abdominal obesity in childhood. There's this emerging idea of the healthy obese versus the non-healthy obese, and whether, a fit, overweight person, this is a long and arcane topic. But the point here is that fitness was really very much, as they were able to study in this particular article, a very important fact in childhood and how it impacted health later in life. Something for us as pediatricians, child health workers, to really understand, and it's very important. But what about the effects of being physically active throughout life? And this is a study that just came out about a year ago that looked at, and there are very few hunting-gathering societies left in the world, and the hunting-gathering societies are sort of important to us because they probably reflect to a much better degree the ecological niche to which we humans actually evolved. It's not what we're doing here, I can tell you that right now. And it's not, stopping at Bethesda Bagels in the morning with a, like a 10,000 calorie bagel with all kinds of stuff on it. It really was, we evolved into a niche where food was not so easy to get. And you should remember this, that at the beginning of the whole obesity crisis, which goes back about 25 or 30 years, people started noticing this. There was a tendency at the beginning to blame obese people. They would say, you're an evil person, you just eat too much. The truth of the matter is we are designed to eat too much because we didn't know in the ecological niche into which we came when that next meal was going to be. And so you ate more than you needed to do the next hours of physical activity. And so there was a great article in Science about 10 years ago that said the fight to maintain normal weight is not for the, it's only for the brave parts, and because you're dealing with some really tough biological issues here. So this group of anthropologists studied these modern hunter-gatherers. These are the Hadza people in northern part of Tanzania, who are still largely practicing hunter-gatherer. And what they found was that physical activity patterns and the biomarkers of cardiovascular disease risk, and what was so interesting to me about this study is that they showed that the Hadza participants spend large amounts of time in moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA, and they maintain these activities across the lifespan. And what was the effect on cardiovascular disease risk? Well, first of all, in fact, the Hadza engaged in over 14 times as much MVPA as subjects participating in the large epidemiological studies that we've seen in the United States. So this is very much a lifestyle problem. And this, I think, is the punchline, is that they found no evidence of risk factors for cardiovascular disease in this population. There was a low prevalence of hypertension across the lifespan. There were optimal levels of biomarkers of cardiovascular health. Now, obviously, there are many other confounding factors of nutrition, et cetera, but it's really important when we have this discussion with our colleagues and we talk about the importance of reasonable levels of physical activity, that we have data like this that really demonstrates to you that we're not just in some kind of a religious belief that exercise is good for everyone. Okay, let's talk about VO2 max. You ready for VO2 max? So many of you have heard of VO2 max. How many of you have done a VO2 max test? Okay, I'm going to get back to you guys in a sec. I say VO2 max and other sorrows. VO2 max, for those of you who don't know, it stands for maximal oxygen uptake. It has been considered the gold standard of how we assess fitness for over 100 years. It was measured in the Harvard Fatigue Lab, which was a very famous laboratory that was established in the early part of the last century, in the 1900s. And it was located in the basement of the Harvard School of Business. And you will get the Irvine Prize if at the end of the lecture you can tell me why was the Harvard Fatigue Lab in 1915 put in the School of Business. Okay, now we got the video. Let's see if it works. I think I have to push the button over here.
Dawn of a fatal day, and the wind begins to speak with a roar that no man can fail to hear. In a 40-mile-an-hour gale, the feather span weaves like a ribbon in a swinging twist that you wouldn't believe possible unless you could see it.
So I got a little worried at this point. There was a guy in a car.
There's an automobile caught on the heaving roadway.
I want you to think about what
11,000-pound feather span twists and strains the giant cables that support it.
Cables of starting to break.
6,300 wire strands, each 17 inches thick.
Complex structure, integrated mechanisms like the human body. I think I can take this. Let's listen to work.
No structure of steel and concrete can stand such a strain. Steel girders buckle and giant cables snap like puny threads. There it goes! Engineers are divided as to the cause of the disaster. Some claim it was the use of solid girders. Others differ. But whatever the reason, Tacoma will rebuild. This time a bridge that will not provide a super thrill in the news.
So, the reason that this is important to us is because when we do cardiorespiratory exercise testing, we're trying to avoid that. In many physiological and engineering systems, there is the early detection of impending danger. You would have liked to have known, for example, that that bridge couldn't withstand a day of very gusty winds before you built it, right? And there are several ways of testing things like this. You could somehow load the bridge and wait until it actually collapsed. Now, that would be a very accurate test, but not a useful test. Now, let's start thinking about how we look at physiological systems. the early detection is built into the physiological responses. And we know this. This is sometimes called feed-forward mechanisms. We're thirsty before our sodium is 180, right? If we became thirsty at 175, we couldn't do much about it, right? Your hunger before you have no glycogen left in your muscles. How many of you watched the Olympics and looked at some of those cross-country ski guys, and they were probably truly glycogen depleted, and the guy who won, the Finnish guy, I don't know if you saw that, who won the ski, the marathon, the 50-kilometer, he missed his last juice, and everybody thought he was going to die. But we're clearly hungry before we are truly hypoglycemic. We're breathless before we have true respiratory failure, and fatigue precedes failure of ATP rephosphorylation in the muscle tissue. And the approach that we really have applied in cardiorespiratory disease is what we would call non-destructive testing. This is a well-defined phrase in engineering where you do something to the bridge or to the human body or to the kidneys that doesn't destroy them but tells you something about it that can indicate whether that individual is near what we would call system failure. And this is what really we do with cardiorespiratory testing. And NDT is a wide group of analytic techniques used in science and technology and industry to evaluate the properties of a material, component, or system without causing damage. And that's really the important point of this. And we know our adults have been really found a beautiful example of exercise in NDT with cardiac stress testing. And in cardiac stress testing, maybe some of you have had cardiac stress testing, but you've got this signal, which is ST depression, which you see during exercise, that's an indicator of coronary artery disease, but it doesn't give the person a heart attack. Now, this maybe seems like ridiculous ad absurdum, but that's the beauty of that test. You can apply a perturbation, the exercise, you increase oxygen consumption of the heart, and you can see a sign that tells you that there's something wrong here, and that's a very good test. Okay, what happens in an exercise test that we do now? So this is an actual exercise test of a child. We use an electronically brake cycle ergometer. What that means is that as this kid is exercising, the work gets harder and harder. There's an electronical brake. The other Irvine question is, why do we have a fan there? We'll talk about that later. And then when you do the exercise test, we get a lot of rich physiological information, and we're able to actually measure breath by breath changes in oxygen uptake, changes in CO2 production. So we're collecting thousands of data points in a typical max test, which usually lasts between 8 and 10 minutes. So that was the beginning of the test. And what we do with VO2 max is we try to push the individual to what we call the limit of his or her tolerance. And I'll show you what.
Go, good job. Go on, push. Above 70. Good job, buddy. Go. Almost there. Push. Almost there. Keep moving the brake. Good job, buddy. Go. Go. Doing great. Good job. Go. Keep moving. Almost there. Good job, buddy.
So that's what you do in a VO2 max test. Now, those of you who did it, there were a few of you over there. Did you enjoy it? No. It's not a comfortable test. It's not a physiological test. Human beings and most mammals rarely do VO2 max. And when you do VO2 max, your pH is 7.1 or 7.0, which is going to set off alarm bells. Your catecholamines have exponentially increased. Your IL-6 is like you have the flu. So even though this is the gold standard, it is a very tough test to do. And it is an example of actually watching the bridge fall down, and I'll explain that in a minute. And one of the great physiologists, he's not known for this, Ralph Waldo Emerson, made a statement that was really important to us. It's not the destination, it's the journey, and I'll explain that in a second. So this is what an exercise test looks like. So we've got oxygen uptake on the y-axis, and we have time We could also look at oxygen uptake as a function of heart rate or CO2 production. But pretend it's time. This is what the work rate looks like. We usually do what's called a ramp function. Why do you think we call it a ramp function? Just kidding, you're smart. So the work rate just increases in a ramp. This is what the gas exchange looks like. So we're collecting a lot of data. And then we reach this golden point. And this golden point is right here, where you see that even though the work rate is increasing, the oxygen uptake is not. You achieve a plateau, and it's a true biological max. In other words, the person is doing more work, but they can't increase their oxygen uptake. And when physiologists discovered this at the Harvard Fatigue Lab, which that I mentioned that's in the basement of the School of Business, so they said, wow, we have discovered something really important. In some ways, this is a failure, isn't it? Because you can no longer increase your oxygen uptake, but it occurs at a point that's really quite uncomfortable. And how many of you would have a patient with congenital heart disease that had been operated on, or a child with kidney disease? You saw what the team was doing to that kid at the end of that test. How many of you would be comfortable in yelling and screaming at that kid? What we would do, what I used to do, is I would say, this is, times have changed. Your sister did much better. Sorry. So we would use all kinds, or some people have done studies where they took out a $20 bill and they said, can you keep going? That's the other way, and usually you could. So this point is very non-physiological, but because it was this sort of undeniable point of system failure, everybody used it, and we called it, the gold standard, and it has really helped the science of exercise. But I'm a little worried that it hasn't helped the clinical application of exercise. And what I meant by the Emerson quote is just think about this. Look at all this data that we're collecting. And when you think about what we do as human beings, we don't do VO2 max. We go from one energy level to another very quickly, right? Watch a basketball game. Watch professional basketball players. You're going to see stop-start activity. The one paper that I wrote that's actually been quoted by a lot of people was a paper that we did where we did direct observations of children, and we tried to scale them into activity patterns. And as everybody here in this room would know intuitively, activity patterns in children and human beings are like this. They're not like a ramp function. And what we need to learn now, and we have the tools to do it, is to begin to capture this data and look at these dynamic responses and from it determine the fitness of a child. That's VO2 max. This is the area that we really need to be focusing on in the future. And this is true found art from our exercise lab. I found this many years ago. I don't want to do it anymore because I'm tired, and I don't want to do it anymore. The end, I'm sorry. That's the real thing. Okay, here's a quiz for, this is question number 2. So here's a progressive exercise test in 2 11-year-old boys, child A and child B. And what I'm showing you is oxygen uptake is a function of heart rate. So they're on the bike, the work rate is getting harder and harder, both heart rate and oxygen uptake are going up. There's child A, there's child B, very different responses, right? Everybody can see that. Okay, there appears to be a marked difference in the oxygen uptake heart rate relationship between child A and child B. The difference is most likely caused by technical errors. The oxygen uptake heart rate slope should be constant in children and adults. There should be no difference. So there's something wrong with my machine. Or poor effort on the part of child B. Guy's just not pushing himself. Or C, kid has cystic fibrosis. I did that for our pulmonologist in the audience. Increased pulmonary dead space leads to relative increase in ventilation. Or C, congenital heart disease that has been repaired by a Fontan procedure. Any guesses? Or educated guesses? Okay, so the answer is well, I'm sure you all had it right. So this is a kid with a congenital heart disease that had been repaired by Fontan. It's a paper we wrote a long, long time ago. And the thing, I want to show this to you because of the richness of the information that you can get from an exercise test when you measure oxygen uptake, heart rate, ventilation, and so forth. And remember, You probably don't remember this, but this is from your basic physiology. This is the fundamental cardiac output. This equation, oxygen uptake is stroke volume times heart rate times the arteriovenous oxygen difference, right? Now, this is, unless I put lines in there, I'm not going to measure that. Stroke volume is hard, but if I have oxygen uptake and I have heart rate, and I look at this delta, here's the slope, delta VO2, delta heart rate. Here is, it's proportional to the stroke volume and AVDO2. So I'm getting an indication of stroke volume. So what do we know about the Fontan? What does it do to the stroke volume? It reduces the stroke volume. And you saw in the oxygen uptake heart rate diagram how well you could see that from a functional test. You didn't have to push this kid to max if you didn't want to, because you're looking at the slope. You're looking at the journey rather than the destination. And the pediatric cardiologists have really been one group of pediatricians that have accepted and used exercise testing to make real clinical decisions, like when they need to put a new size stent in, for example, because pulmonary blood flow wasn't good enough, because you weren't getting enough blood to the lungs to do the oxygen uptake, which you can now measure on a breath-to-breath basis. So this is just one example. This is the set of gears that my wonderful mentor, Carl Wasserman, developed back in the 1960s. You go from mitochondria all the way to the breast. You have all of these interacting physiological systems, muscle, heart and blood, and lungs. And this just shows these are all the things that you can measure and learn about from gas exchange and from exercise testing. And it really ranges from tissue-level oxygen transport, behavior, social, environmental, upper airway dynamics. There's some interesting studies about laryngeal function during exercise and so forth and so on, and we don't have time to go through all the things that we can talk about. So beyond gas exchange. Well, we pediatricians love growth and development. We think it's really one of the most interesting and fascinating parts of the human experience. And we know that exercise can stimulate the growth of many tissues. You know, we go to the gym, we want our muscles to be toned and bigger, and exercise stimulates muscle growth. It causes you to have new mitochondria. It's very important for bone health, and it's probably one of the most important reasons that children should be physically active is to prevent osteoporosis later in life. We're learning more and more about that. It grows new neurons, and it grows new blood vessels. So this is the powerful trophic effect of exercise. And we've always been interested in this because the endocrinologists knew that if they had a child who had short stature, one of the ways to determine whether that child had growth hormone deficiency was to do an exercise challenge, because an exercise challenge will cause a big burst of growth hormone. And so they would use this as a clinical test. And here's an example. This is a healthy kid. Here's growth hormone. We did some exercise for just about 10 minutes, and you see that big burst of growth hormone. So I thought, being a sort of a naive person, about 20 years ago, I'm still naive, I'm just older. So we thought, gee, growth hormone, maybe that's why you have a fitness effect, right? You exercise, stimulate growth hormone, makes your muscles grow. So we said, let's do an experiment. So we had a simple hypothesis that said, if we could block growth hormone, if we could keep growth hormone from going up, maybe we could block the training effect of exercise. Great idea. And well, how would we block the growth hormone? So what we did was, we thought this was very clever. Rather than do a hypophysectomy, right, where you do a surgical procedure on the rat and take out the growth hormone secreting cells, we thought that was a little bit, that would affect the animal in too many ways. We used anti-growth hormone releasing hormone antibodies. And so you can see that in the treated rat, they were about 40% smaller than the untreated rat. And we predicted that these rats, when we trained them, and I learned how to train rats on a treadmill, a little treadmill, not the big treadmill, that there would be no training effect. And we wanted to look at the molecular impact. This is back in the 90s. We were just learning how to look at the gene expression, and so it was a really exciting study. This was published in 1994. We looked at the effect of growth hormone suppression on IGF-1 gene expression in response to exercise training. So you all know that, it didn't show. There's a picture here. I'll just tell you what happened. We looked at IGF-1 because we all know that it's not the growth hormone that causes the growth. It's the growth hormone that stimulates factors like IGF-1. And imagine a couple of bars over there. Basically what we found was this. And it was a pretty seminal finding at the time. that in the muscle, first of all, the rats that were treated with the anti-growth hormone releasing hormone trained just as well. So our hypothesis was wrong as usual, which was fortunate because then we could write another grant, right, the NIH. So they trained just as well. And what we discovered was that even though there was no evidence of growth hormone, and in the circulating blood, no IGF-1 floating around, in the muscle, the IGF-1 had increased dramatically without growth hormone in response to exercise. And this led to a lot of research that has subsequently been done, and to the MotorPack study, which is, gee, what is it about exercise that actually at a tissue level causes tissues to grow and change, and mitochondria and so forth and so on. So imagine what a phenomenal slide that was, sorry. Okay, another thing behind the gas exchange is that this is the effect of exercise on circulating leukocytes. So when you go out to exercise, your white cell count goes way up. And it's not because you haven't done it before, it's just this is one of the stress responses to exercise. And I had a friend who had gone to medical school with me as a cancer researcher, and I remember talking to him, and he said, yeah, he said, you know, when we wanted to harvest lymphocytes, we would have our subjects go run around Golden Gate Park. You see San Francisco is right up by Golden Gate Park. And, you know, they'd come back and we could harvest their lymphocytes, but we never thought that it was interesting at all. So this shows in children the impact of exercise on every subtype of leukocyte that you can imagine. They go up quite substantially, and you can see NK cells, the natural killer cells, go up really to a large degree. So we said, gee, what's happening to the gene expression of these white blood cells? What's going on there? Is there some health-related thing? So here's the experiment we did. There's a blood vessel over here, and you can see that it's got a whole different bunch of different kinds of white cells. And we take some blood, we measure a global gene signal, then we do exercise, and there are direct effects of exercise that could affect gene expression. For example, heat, hypoxia, acidosis, catecholamines, all these things happen when you exercise. And then you have indirect effects. You have recruitment of leukocytes that are marginalized. A lot of them are sitting in the lung, as you know, and all of a sudden they're leaving the lung and coming out into the central circulation. At the end of the exercise, we take another blood sample. We've got many more cells, and we're getting a global signal. And we wondered what the effect was, and we wrote a series of papers. Let me just show you one thing. So first of all, when you exercise and you look at the genes in your white blood cells, there are thousands of genes that change. Many of them are things that you think make sense. Here we compared a group of early pubertal girls with late pubertal girls. These are the genes that change. PBMC stands for peripheral blood mononuclear cells. So these are all the cells, and I can tell you that, you know, the lymphocytes are different from the monocytes and so forth and so on. Each one has its own particular pattern of gene exchange, the gene expression change in response to exercise. But you've got JAK-STAT signaling, ubiquitin-mediated proteolysis. You have apoptosis cells. You have cells involved in bone mineralization. And we're just beginning to unravel what all this means and its role for health. Here's one example that we're really focusing on, and this has to do with the early origin of atherosclerosis. So all of you know that when you look at atherosclerosis, it's like osteoporosis, a disease that actually begins in childhood. And this began with studies that had been done on autopsy specimens from Korean War soldiers, young men who had died in the war, and they found evidence of plaque formation in very young people. And it began to occur to folks that the plaques that you see in advanced atherosclerosis might have had their origin in childhood, and the more we study this, and the better we get at using ultrasound techniques, for example, to look at carotid intimal media thickness, we're beginning to think this is true. So when we looked at the effect of exercise just on monocytes, and we looked at the gene expression, we found some really interesting things. These genes, amphoregulin, NR4A1, and epiregulin, these are growth factors. So these were increasing by 20 and 30-fold. This is from 20 minutes of exercise. Now, why is this important for atherosclerosis? Because there's two kinds of monocytes. There's monocytes that contribute to atherosclerosis. If you look at the lesion in an adult who has advanced atherosclerosis and you look at the actual plaque, it's full of inflammatory cells that have gobbled up the bad LDLs, all the bad cholesterol, and stay there and contribute to an ongoing inflammatory process. But there's another kind of monocyte, the ones that express those genes that I just showed you, that patrol along the walls of the vasculature. And when they see damages in the vascular wall, which is where the plaque will begin, they actually repair it. They secrete some of these growth factors, and it leads to repair. And so we wondered if we could demonstrate that brief exercise in children actually leads to an increase in a population of those kinds of cells. We aren't done with this study, but how are we going to look at the interaction between the monocyte and the cell wall? It's hard to do in a living human being. So our tissue engineers did this microfluidic in vitro vascular system. This is a vascular system grown on a chip. This is all endothelial cells that form a vascular system. This is just showing it with some fluorescent. And then we squirted some monocytes. Here's the monocytes. You can see them. And what was really cool is that some of the monocytes traverse the vascular system. Some of them are stuck. And so here's an experimental model that we can use where we could take monocytes from a child or an adult before exercise, put them in a microfluidic chamber like this, and actually quantify their functional effects and their interaction. And so these are the kinds of studies you can do with exercise. So what's the brave new world? So this is where we have to be going. This is physical activity using a wearable monitor in an otherwise healthy child. No one should be surprised that this is morning, kid wakes up. You can also study sleep, by the way, with some of these wearable monitors. And nobody here is surprised that it's fairly chaotic. Patty Friedson was an emeritus professor up at the University of Massachusetts, a PhD in exercise science. She started studying habitual physical activity in children about 30 years ago. Everybody laughed at her. They go, oh, come on, that's so trivial. She's now the most sought-after consultant for, all these companies that are Fitbit. They're going, Patty, we need you to come to our meeting. How do we gauge this? There are 70 NIH studies out there right now that are using wearable monitors to assess habitual physical activity. So that's the good news. Bad news is all of these companies, and there's 8 or 10 of them, they have proprietary data architecture. You can't really see the raw data. And there's no interoperability. So I don't know if you're wearing a Garmin and I'm wearing an Apple, whether the reads that I get compared to the reads that you get. And this is true at the beginning of technologies almost inevitably, is that there has to be a period of maturation where we really can have this elusive interoperability. But this large data is amenable to computers that we didn't have 20 years ago. We can do machine learning around patterns of physical activity that would have been impossible before. And by the way, we can use machine learning in just a cardiorespiratory fitness test, and I can look at all that data I have, and I can begin to find things that I may not have thought of that were important and relevant to cardiovascular and respiratory health. Here's another example, big data analytics and machine learning. This is from Kim Liu, who's in our shop, a pediatric pulmonologist. She's looking at the glucocorticoid receptor on leukocytes. That's a pretty important receptor, the glucocorticoid receptor. It's involved in how we respond to anti-asthma drugs. And one of the things is, how many of you have done flow cytometry? So, flow cytometry can be very subjective, right? You look at these little populations of cells, and then you draw a little circle, and you get an answer, and say, yeah, I don't like that answer, I'm going to draw my circle over here. And one of the problems is that it's beyond our brain's ability to do a multi-dimensional image of 14 different dyes or markers. We can't conceptualize that in our brain, but a big computer can. And using these more modern techniques, for example, she's just, and this is not even published yet, but she's discovering populations of cells that no one has ever seen before in response to exercise in asthmatic patients. Those of us who are pulmonologists here know that someday we're going to have a biomarker for asthma. Right now, none of us do. We all, we've probably all had this discussion with the parents and say, I wish I had a blood tube. You have the kid that's wheezed a couple times, and the mom or dad says, does my child have asthma? And we hem and haw. We say, well, I think so. we really aren't there yet, and this might be one of the ways we get to that. Just a word in closing about the molecular transducers of physical activity. This is a common fund, which means it's felt by Francis Collins, who's the director of the NIH, that this idea of trying to understand from a molecular point of view why exercise actually is good for people or how it benefits health transcends so many of the traditional centers and institutes within the NIH that he's got a couple of bucks, well, more than a couple of bucks, that he's able to use for these studies. This is actually a $170 million project. We're going to enroll about 3,000 people over the next, I think it's 4 or 5 years. We're the great good fortune to be named the Pediatric Center. I had the great good fortune. I'm in charge of the Recruitment and Retention Committee, and we wanted to get somebody who we thought would be famous or somewhat famous to help us make a video. And about a month ago, we got Peggy Whitson. Peggy Whitson is the commander of the International Space Station. And she agreed to this, and I was like a kid in a candy shop because I went to the Johnson Space Center, and we did this interview with her in the mock-up of the International Space Center. And she's a typical underachieving astronaut. She has a PhD in biochemistry. She has the most number of days of extravehicular walks of any human being. She has the most number of days in space. So this was a thrill. So keep attuned to this study. We're just going to start to recruit people soon. And we're going to be able, and we've really turned it into a lifespan study. And this really is another example of how the CTSAs have been so important. There's a couple of us who are CTSA types. And the CTSAs have been very interested in this concept of lifespan research. And the investigators that had gotten together for this study really didn't think in those terms. And we were able to introduce this idea that if we're going to collect a population of human beings from age 11 to no upper age limit, we should think about how we're going to do this as a lifespan study. We all know that there's a profound difference between biological age and chronological age. I mean, we've all met people who are in their 50s or 60s who seem very, very different in their ability to engage the physical world. And this study may help us understand that difference. And of course, exercise is tied to executive function. I found these are the Wasserman gears. I found this study with the gears. We know that kids who are more physically active do better in school. And this is probably even more so in lower socioeconomic districts. We're starting to look at this data right now. And it reminded me of this quote from Alice in Wonderland. And this is going to ultimately help us answer the question is, what motivates a child to start exercise? What motivates a child to stop? It's this integration of physiological signals that is modulated by executive function. And so this is this great quote. So she was wondering in her own mind whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisy. And so I'll leave you with this idea. I hope that the pleasure of asking me a question would be worth the trouble of raising your hand and asking your question. Thank you very much. So I'd love to hear from you guys. There's no bad questions, except from your chair.
Simply incredible. Thank you so much for that. What a tour de force. You know, thank you for documenting all these associations of the positive health outcomes of early life activity later in the lifespan, and they're fabulous. But documenting them is important, but I want to hear more about the interventions, and I think the generalists in the room would want to hear about that. What is working in school-age children to get them going and sustain that across the lifespan?
This is a great question. Since I'm in Washington, I will give you a very circuitous response and never really answer your question because we don't know yet. But we actually put together, we got a gift from a foundation to ask pediatricians what they know about exercise and what they tell their patients. And you all know, and everybody in this room knows, that you really almost have no formal introduction to exercise science or any of the things that I've talked about. So most pediatricians look at the BMI and sort of make their decisions about the physical activity of the child with BMI, which is partially true but can be misleading at the time. So what are the ways that we can reinvigorate physical activity and really achieve what would be healthy levels? Well, one is to know what they are, and we're not sure what they are yet. We know that the very inactive kids and the kids that don't have PE in schools really do poorly when you look at cardiovascular disease risk. So one thing that we can all do is find out at the child's school if there is a PE program. That's not enough, though, because if we're going to be activists, then we need to find out what happens in your PE program. in Project Healthy, one of the things that we discovered was that you could have 60 kids in a PE program, and the school would tell us, yes, we have 3 times a week, 40 minutes of PE. But then when you went and watched the PE, this is what happened. You had 60 kids sitting there. The PE teacher, who could have been an English teacher or a math teacher with no skills in dealing with a group of 40 or 60 kids, would take 20 minutes to take roll. And then the next thing, they would have each kid line up and shoot a basket. And that was the end of the period. So one of the things we can do is use the existing tools that we have, like school PE, and make sure that they're used well and taught by teachers who have training in how to do this. One of the things that's amazing is, you may not know this, but somewhere between 60 and 70% of school children in the United States live in states where there is mandated school fitness in the 5th, 7th, and 9th grade. Do you guys know that? Some of your kids may have come and told you, I did the terrible mile run today, or I did the shuttle run. That's great data. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if the pediatrician was in his or her office, kid comes in for vaccination, whatever, and pops up on the EMR the results of that fitness test? The studies are being done. In most cases, the data are not even getting back to the kids. The value of data like that for the national effort to sort of cardiovascular disease prevention is huge. For kids with disabilities, cerebral palsy, kids who are recovering from cancer, heart disease, we really need research. We really need to try to understand what we do with those kids, because you can't simply tell them do what the other kids are doing. That was a bad answer to a really good question.
Then I would like to actually concentrate on the other aspect of the bridge, but
the bridge is held down.
So the question is, you know, everybody who has kids, for example, on varsity teams, they are being pushed beyond belief, without any testing at all before the coach pushes them, you know, to the limit. And the question is, could we, and should we, and how should we test these kids before they get distracted?
I think this is a really, really good question. We have a good friend who's the head of kinesiology at University of Florida, who's was an NFL football player, and he's very concerned with exactly what you brought out. The coaches think that they can push these kids, you know, without any limitations. And it's really an interesting thing when you think about it, is that we human beings have the ability to override our physiological signals that are telling you to stop. I mean, we know that in basic training in the military, for example, there's 10 or 15 or 20 people who die every year. And if you were to interview them and say, were you feeling good before you died? No, they weren't, you know, but we as human beings, and this could have been an advantage as we evolved, we can do this. And so these kids can do this, and the coach is a big figure. So this is another area where we need to really train coaches, especially the competitive athletic ones, that they could be doing much more damage. And there are kids who develop myoglobinuria, who develop chronic joint pain for the rest of their lives because of this kind of stuff. Not to mention, you know, the psychological impact. When we did Project Healthy, the other side of the coin was we were able to find the most wonderful PE teachers from around the country, and every one of them would tell you that whenever they were in a social gathering and somebody found out that they were a PE teacher, somebody would come up to them and say, the most embarrassing moment I ever had in my life was when I was in the 7th grade and my PE teacher made me in front of 40 other kids.
Yeah, I have a question. In this rich data set that you have on exercise, whether you also have nutrition data to look a little bit at
in the
synergy.
School fitness?
Well, I know in Healthy they do, but in terms of interaction, and this kind of gets to the first gear, the mitochondria, that whether it's for genetic reasons or otherwise, we know in cardiometabolic risk, a lot starts at the level before you're born, you're set up with dysfunctional energy regulation.
So great question. We don't have good nutrition data because good nutrition data is very hard to get. And if you've dealt with things like food recalls and food records, it's just, again, it's our brains kind of modulating what we actually ate. I mean, we did it, before we did Project Healthy, we studied a group of obese children. We compared their food records with doubly labeled water measurements of energy intake. And these kids were gaining weight even though, according to them, they were losing, they weren't eating enough. So, that's the problem.
But there are plasma markers for carotene,
Correct.
indicators of
Yes.
polyphenol intake that do correlate with better mitochondrial function and kind of synergize, right?
Absolutely. We should be looking at them. It's a debate that's going on in MotorPack right now. And there aren't any nutritionists, except for the NIH people, who are pushing us to do this, but we should do this.
Again, thank you very much for stimulating talk. Given the application that you presented for stress testing and identifying failure, it's also applied to banks. Is there any work going on developing stress tests that might predict failure for violent behavior? Given our current national debate.
I think, so that's actually a really good question. And what's interesting about the stress of exercise, so exercise will elicit stress hormones, but usually not the way the stress biologists do it. Like they'll have people get up in front of crowds and give talks, and it causes stress and anxiety, and you see increases in heart rate. With exercise, you tend not to have the negative effect. So I think it would be a very interesting way to study the psychobiology of stress using two different, very different kinds of ways of eliciting stress. Those are studies that have yet to be done. No guns are allowed in we're a gun-free zone in our.
So, just a couple things. I believe the fatigue lab was in business school because they originally wanted to study it in an industrial setting for business purposes, and it wasn't meant to be a pure physiology lab like it became.
Many Irvine Prize, which means when you come to visit me, I'm going to take you to the closest Starbucks.
They didn't realize they were going to end up with DB Dill. But my question is when I was in grad school and my PhD's in exercise physiology, there was a big push to get med schools to adopt exercise curriculum for the trainees. And, there was some success, and like Marcus Baumann got it in at UAB. But I guess, there's two parts to this question is, what's the current status of that? Is HSM still really pushing that exercise medicine curriculum into med schools? And what is your view on how do you integrate pediatric exercise science into teaching training med students?
Great question. So I would like to see more of it, but and everybody here knows that med school real estate is really, really valuable, and everybody wants. The nutrition folks want more time. We have at our school, at our med school, we have an elective. About 50% of the kids are taking. It's a weekly lecture. I'm shocked. We have a med school of 100. 50 kids are there. They've been there for like 5 weeks in a row. So until you get it on the boards, the USMLEs, et cetera, it's going to be really hard to convince the medical schools to teach it. So all the stuff that we're doing by creating really good databases, by understanding the need, at least for the pediatric case. I think the logic is clear. I mean, the fact that Francis Collins gave $170 million to study this recognizes that here is an environmental behavioral issue that we should be studying, and that the average physician doesn't really know what to tell their patients. So, I don't know the answer to that question except to try many, many different things. And I think if you have grand rounds and we get our residents interested and we develop some electives and we more formalize through American Thoracic Society, for example, we'll eventually achieve that goal. I think my time's up, right? Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.